You're going to cover, well, last week we went through the basics of anatomical position. We started talking about terminology that we can use for describing where things are in the body. We went through a little bit of the organization of the body, okay? Talk about at the cellular level. And today we're going to talk about how the body is broken up into different parts, right? Not at the whole organism level, but in different areas within the body. Okay? I'm going to talk about body cavities and how we can look at different parts of the body in different, what we call subdivisions. Okay? So, first off, all the internal organs are kind of found in one of two areas of the body. Right? There's either a part that's in the front or in the anterior ventral, and a part that's in the back, right? Dorsal portion or posterior. Okay? So, what's in the back? What's back here? Okay, so kidneys more up. What's the most posterior aspect of your body? Vertebrae, your spine, okay? Your vertebrae and your spine are kind of the most posterior part. What's the purpose of the vertebrae of the spine? What are they associated with? The spinal cord, okay? And the spinal cord attaches to what superiorly? The brain, okay? So if we talk about the brain and the spinal cord lives where in terms of the vertebrae? What's the relationship between the spinal cord and the vertebrae? Is the spinal cord posterior to the vertebrae? Is it anterior? Is it to the left, to the right? Where's the spine? So if this is the spinal cord, where are the vertebrae? They surround it, okay? And vertebrae are what? Types of bone, okay? All right, so now we have the spinal cord, vertebrae, bones that surround the spinal cord, and then superiorly, the spinal cord attaches to the brain, and what surrounds the brain? The skull. So the brain, or the area, the cavity that the brain and the spinal cord reside in, that is what we call the dorsal body cavity. Okay? You have an area where the brain lives and an area where the spinal cord lives. Okay? And around that cavity are bones. What's the purpose of those bones? Protection. Is it important that we protect the brain and the spinal cord? Why? What's their function? Control, sensory, movement, regulation, life, survival. Yes? Okay, so pretty important functions, lots of protection. Okay? So the dorsal body cavity, the posterior aspect, okay, completely encased in bone. They are physically separated from the anterior part, right? And the reason why they are physically separated actually roots in the fact that how the brain and the spinal cord develop. So they are developmentally different from the ventral organs, the heart, the lungs, right? The intestines. They do not develop the same way that the brain and the spinal cord do. Okay? If you're interested in that, it's awesome. Take a developmental biology course. It's really fun. Okay? But the dorsal aspect, the dorsal cavity, or the dorsal aspect, posterior aspect, however you want to call it, broken into the cranial cavity. Cranial is skull, right? And so the cranial cavity encloses the skull, or the brain, excuse me. Okay? And then the vertebral canal, the vertebrae that house the spinal cord, right? The bones are made for protecting that vital connections. Okay? The ventral cavity, or the anterior aspect of this, larger than the posterior in terms of size. Okay? It's anterior placed, that's why it's called that. Not encased in bone. Are there organs that are, is there an element of protection in the anterior part of your body?
Ribs.
The rib cage, right? So the thoracic cage, anterior, protection of vital organs, lungs and heart, okay? So the vital organs, brain, spinal cord, lungs, heart, protected, okay? We can partition or divide the anterior cavity into a superior part and an inferior part. So the superior part is the thoracic cavity, okay, or the thorax. And the inferior part is the abdominopelvic cavity. And there's a physical separation between these two. There is an organ that physically distinguishes the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The boundary is the diaphragm. Okay? Everything superior to the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity, inferior to the diaphragm, abdominal pelvic. Okay? Pretty straightforward, yes? All right. So, each of the body cavities, including the dorsal body cavity, are covered in membranes. All right? We're going to talk about the ones in the anterior cavity first. Okay? These serous membranes, all right, they line or cover the cavity wall or each of the organs that are found inside that portion of the cavity. Okay, so we have two choices. Serous membrane, number one, could be on the wall. That is what we call the parietal layer. Okay? Our second choice is, if it's not on the wall, it's going to cover the organ. It covers the organ that is called the visceral layer. Anyone know kind of things that will help you remember? Anyone know what the word evisceration means, or to eviscerate? Anyone heard that before? No. Anyone ever heard that you have a visceral reaction to something? No? The viscera of an organism are the guts. Okay? So if you eviscerate someone, you are literally ripping their guts out. That's what eviscerate means. So visceral refers to guts and it means organ. Okay? So you see a visceral serous membrane, or what we're going to talk about the different types of them in a second, right? It's either visceral or parietal, and that determines where it is. If it's on the wall, it's parietal. If it's on the organ, it's visceral. Make sense? Okay. Between them, between the two layers, there's a small, very small cavity that is usually filled with fluid. Okay? So the serous fluid acts as a lubricant. Okay? So we talk about the thoracic cavity. There's a serous membrane that's on the thoracic cavity wall, and one that covers each of the organs within the thoracic cavity. Let's say the lungs. Okay? What's the purpose of the lubricant that's between the lungs and the thoracic cavity wall? What do the lungs do? They expand and they contract. When you breathe in, your chest opens, right? What happens to the lungs as that occurs? Do the lungs move? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, they do. The heart is also encased in its own cavity within the thoracic cavity, right? And you'll see that in a second. And the heart has the two layers as well. And in between the two layers, are serous fluid. Does the heart move? Hopefully for all of you it does. Okay? Does it move a lot? Does it ever stop moving? Hopefully for all of you, it doesn't, okay? So when you have the two layers that are present, they're going to rub against one another. There's a very small area between them, right? And when they move, the organs move, there's friction that can occur there, okay? By having the lubricant between the serous fluid, between the layers, it allows that movement to occur and reduces the friction. If that fluid wasn't there, you would cause irritation of both layers and can cause problems, okay? Likewise, what happens if there's too much fluid? Think about where the heart is and the fact that the heart kind of is about the size of your fist. And around the heart, say this, my skin in this example is my fist, is the visceral layer of the serous membrane, okay? And now my other hand wrapped around my fist is the outside layer, right? The parietal layer of the serous membrane, okay? If I fill this space between them with fluid, I can move around just fine, right? Good. Now if I put too much fluid, my hand can't get any bigger, right? The outside layer can't get any bigger. So what happens to the inside layer? It puts pressure on the organ. It's like I'm squeezing my fist. I'm squeezing the heart. Does the heart pump as well when that happens? No, it doesn't. The heart has to work harder for that to happen, right, to pump the same amount of blood. And that will then continue to increase, right, until you do something to it. That condition is called pericarditis, okay? And it's also associated with heart failure, right, and makes the heart work more. But it comes right down to this, where this type of anatomy, where things are, and then which is related to the function of the organ itself. Okay? So here's the cavities: cranial cavity, vertebral canal, part of the posterior aspect. And then the anterior aspect, we have the thoracic cavity, right, separated by the diaphragm. Separated by the diaphragm. And then we have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. There's no physical separation between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, okay? Depending upon which textbook you look at, if we had other ones, some of them lump it together into one like this. Others speak about the abdominal and pelvic cavity in separate areas. But really it's just one cavity, different kind of up and down. Looking at the anterior picture on your right here, okay, the thoracic cavity, here's the diaphragm, separates thoracic from abdominal pelvic. But even within the thoracic cavity, there are different areas. First off, we have this area right here, outlined in yellow. That's called the mediastinum. Okay, in there you have there's part of the trachea, the bronchi. The esophagus goes right down through the mediastinum, and the big vessels that go and attach to the heart, right? This is where the heart is. Sits inside this cavity right here, okay? This cavity in blue, right, is called the pericardial cavity, okay? Peri means around, cardia refers to heart. Right, perimeter, kind of pericardial cavity. The lungs are in that kind of like green color outlined here in white now. Whoops. Right? Those are the lungs are found in the pleural cavity. Right? So the pleural cavity is really the whole outside of the thoracic cavity. And then there's a separate smaller cavity where the heart lives inside the thoracic cavity, called the pericardium. Okay? So right now we're going to talk about what I like to call the 3 Ps. Okay? We're going to talk about the pleura, the pericardia, or the pericardium, and the last one is the peritoneum. Okay? When we've talked about these the thoracic cavity so far and the abdominal pelvic cavity, we said that there's what types of serous membranes? It's either the one on the wall, which is called parietal, or the one on the organ, which is called visceral. Okay. Now the next step is we can further classify that into where it is. Okay? It's either visceral or parietal. If it's in the thoracic cavity, it's the visceral or parietal pleura. If it's in the pericardial cavity, it's either visceral or parietal pericardium. All right? And then finally, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, it's either visceral or parietal peritoneum. Okay? So think about it. You can kind of make a little flow chart. Serous membrane, identify. Is it on the organ or on the wall? Right? It's either visceral or parietal. And then, is it in the abdomen? Yes or no? Is it in the thorax? Yes or no? Is this, whatever I'm asking you, in the lungs, right? Or in the thorax, okay? It makes sense? So if I asked you to identify the serous membrane, the specific serous membrane layer that you would find lining the abdominal cavity, what would that be? Don't all jump up at once. Abdominal cavity means parietal, it's lining the wall. Peritoneum, it's in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay? Identify the specific serous membrane layer that you would find lining the lungs. Are we talking about the wall or the organ? The organ. So if it's the organ, it's called the visceral, and it's the visceral pleura. Does that make sense? Okay. Now these serous membranes are kind of the analogy or the description they use is the fist in the balloon. Okay? So if I had a balloon that's kind of loosely filled with water, right? And I pushed my fist into the balloon. Think about what that looks like, right? And I pushed it in. There'd be a layer of latex rubber that is right attached to right on my skin of my fist. Yes? That layer of latex rubber would be considered the visceral serous membrane, the visceral layer. It's right on the organ. The other layer, the outside of the balloon, separated by the fluid inside the balloon, right, would be considered the parietal layer. It's on the outside. And then the water within the balloon itself would be considered what? Serous fluid. Does that make sense? I think I might have to actually bring in the balloon next time. I think I talk about it a little bit, but I don't know if you guys visualize it the way I want you to. I think you do. But then again, I can't like blow up the balloon when I come in. All right, so mediastinum, right, that middle space in the thoracic cavity and in the pericardium, both parietal and visceral pericardium. All right, the visceral pericardium is the surface of the heart organ, right, and the fibrous produce the parietal layer actually lines that part of the cavity. Okay? Pay attention to these here. All right, so in these little parts of the PowerPoint start to tell you where the organs are. Right? You start to be able to identify where the organs that I'm going to ask for are present in the different portions of the body itself. Okay, so then we talked about pleura. Again, two-layered serous membrane that's in the pleural cavity. Outer layer lines the surface of the thoracic wall. Inner layer, surface of the lungs. Okay, And in the lungs, this is really important. Because if I have, let's say this is your thoracic wall, right? And in the lungs here in blue, part of the lungs, okay, rely on the connection and the serous fluid within the serous cavity, between the layers. All right, so in yellow here, you would have this layer of or serous fluid. Right, so really what you're looking at is parietal membrane, serous membrane, or visceral membrane, and they're kind of stuck together because of the serous fluid between them. Okay? And it allows the lungs to inflate really easily. When you breathe in, it goes out, right? It allows you to breathe in. In some cases, if you have a traumatic injury, right, you get hit by a football player, and it can sometimes disrupt the connection between the lung and the thoracic wall. And now there's this bubble that happens right here of air, right? Or it could actually be blood fills in that area. What do you think that does for the function of the lungs?
Pressure on it? Puts pressure on it?
Puts pressure on it. So now this part of the lung that's over here, it can't fill with air because there's something blocking it. All right? And the serous fluid isn't holding that part of the lung open. So this part of the lung actually, we call collapses. It collapses down on it like that. So now it's more difficult to breathe. You can't get as much air into your lungs. This is what's called, anyone ever heard of a pneumothorax? Yes, some of you, right? Or a hemothorax, right? A pneumothorax is that there's air in the lungs and separating the connection between these two serous membranes. Okay? And now this part of the lung doesn't open. Well, a partially collapsed lung, right? That's what that is. All right? How do we get rid of that? You've all seen Grey's Anatomy. Come on. You got to get the air, or you got to get whatever that obstruction is out. So what they'll do is they'll take a needle, all right, and aspirate out that blood or air, all right, and will allow that to be removed, and will help. Hopefully, you can kind of reinflate that lung with some outside help. Okay, and that will then reestablish the connection between the thoracic wall and the serous membrane, and thereby reinflating the lung. Okay, but it comes down to the connection between serous membrane. Okay, so here you see a pericardial cavity and the pleural cavity, kind of separation between the two cavities, even within the thoracic cavity. And then we talked about the abdominal pelvic cavity. Abdominal is superior, pelvic is inferior. And the abdominal cavity includes which organs? Think about, we're below the diaphragm. That includes stomach, spleen, pancreas, small and large intestine, liver, gallbladder. The kidneys are down there. All right, the appendix, all of that is present. All right, most of the ureters are in the abdominal cavity. In the pelvic cavity, the most inferior part, internal reproductive organs, parts of the large intestine, and the bladder, right, sit low. They sit low and actually underneath the connection of where your hip bones are, right? So really below that, kind of where your hip bones are is kind of like the boundary of where the pelvic cavity can start. Talked about the peritoneum. All right, so peritoneum is found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's the serous membrane, visceral and parietal. Okay? Not all organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity are surrounded by the peritoneum. Okay? There are some that are called, or parts of some, that are called retroperitoneal. What does retro mean?
Like towards the back or behind?
It could be towards the back, behind, right? And that's what is happening here. The kidneys, for example, are retroperitoneal. They are outside or behind the peritoneum. Okay? Do the kidneys move very much? Hopefully not. Okay? No, they don't. So they don't need to have that serous membrane, to provide that protection or that ease of movement. Right? The kidneys are protected in a fibrous with a fibrous capsule and a fat pad behind it for outside trauma. So they are retroperitoneal. Part of the pancreas is actually retroperitoneal. Again, it doesn't really move that much. Okay? But so you know what the word retroperitoneal means now. All right, so this is a little different than the pleura because the peritoneum kind of grows out or extends out and wraps around the portions of the intestines and the organs that we're talking about. All right? The other function of the peritoneum here in the intestines is to hold things in place. Okay? By wrapping around, say, the small intestine, which is going to move and contract and move food through this tube, it holds it in its place. If it wasn't there, you could run around and end up, forming a knot in your intestines, and that wouldn't be good. Okay, things could just move in all over the place. So the peritoneum works to kind of hold things where they are. Between the layers, there's also where blood vessels and nerves extend out to these organs, right? And that's called, where those blood vessels and nerves run out to is called the mesentery. All right, but that's an extension of the peritoneum, kind of in between the layers of the peritoneum. The peritoneum is also where fat can accumulate in the body, and there's attachment points within the abdominal pelvic cavity, and here's one what's called the greater omentum. The greater omentum is one of the connections of the peritoneum to the stomach. You have one that's on the outside of the stomach and one that's on the underside. So it holds it in place. So the stomach is here on your left, right? You've probably felt when your stomach rumbles or whatever, you feel like it's moving. Luckily, it's not moving all over the place. Okay? It's held in place by the peritoneum. This omentum can also accumulate fat. And there's one that's on the underside of the stomach and one that's on the top side of the stomach, the greater and lesser. And that help hold all of these organs in place and provide a little cushioning and insulation as well. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. So when we talk about the organs of the abdomen, we can describe where they are, all right, based upon one of two conventions, or both, really. You can either have a tic-tac-toe board or quadrants, okay? The tic-tac-toe board is basically 9 sections, 3 rows, and the top row, the most superior, starting in the middle, is what we call the epigastric region. Think about it, just underneath the sternum, right? That's your in the middle, that's your epigastric region. Epi means above or on the surface of, gastric refers to stomach. And part of your stomach is right underneath that. And a very small portion of your liver is in the epigastric region. Okay? To the right and left of that are what we call the hypochondriac regions. All right, right and left. The right hypochondriac region, a lot of your liver. The left hypochondriac region, a little bit of your stomach. Right, your stomach and mainly stomach and part of your pancreas. The center square of your tic-tac-toe board, right, is what we call it's around the belly button, is the umbilical region. right? The belly button is the umbilicus. That is the umbilical region. To right or left of that center square corresponds with that lumbar area of your back. So right lumbar, left lumbar of the abdomen. Okay? Center, the most inferior center part is called the hypogastric region, and this is probably the one that's most confusing. Hypo means below or under, right? So when you see hypogastric, you might think it's under the stomach. It's actually under the umbilicus, right? It's well down, right? Center row, middle. And then left and right iliac regions are on either side of that hypogastric region, and they correspond with your hip bones. Your hip bones are what's called the iliac crests, okay? And so those are your right and left iliac regions. The quadrants are easy, right? Starting with an area just above the center of the quadrants, just above the belly button, you have a right upper, right lower, left lower, right? And this is just to describe where someone might feel pain, where they might, feel disruption, or where things are moving, okay? Where trauma could be, all right? So, little Tommy's at school, and he's playing on the playground, and he falls off the monkey bars and lands on his right side. On his right side, towards the back, let's say. Okay? He goes to the school nurse, and he's like, my body hurts right here. Okay? And so she's looking at it, the right lower quadrant, more of the lumbar region than the iliac region. Is the nurse correct in thinking that little Tommy could have ruptured his appendix? Is that a possibility? Yes or no, and why? Where's the appendix? Is it on the right side or the left side? Is that a TIE fighter?
Hmm?
Your tattoo?
No.
Oh, what is it?
Still elect
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It looked like a... Anyways, go.
Is it on the right?
Where's the appendix, on the right or the left? It's on the right. So is the school nurse correct in thinking he could have hurt his appendix? Yes? He could have, right? Typically it would be a lot lower, right? If someone has an appendicitis, they're feeling it low in the right right iliac region of pain, right lower quadrant. Okay? Could little Tommy have hurt his, would you think he could have hurt his left kidney if he was hurting on his right lower side? Probably not, right? Probably not. Okay. Sometimes there are times when someone will, oh, does this hurt? Does that hurt? Right? You go to the doctor and he's palpating the stomach or the abdomen, and he's going, does this hurt? That hurt? There's a thing called referred pain, where my kidney hurts. There's a problem with my kidney, which is up here, right, up in the lumbar region of the abdomen, but it actually hurts in the lower left iliac region, lower down, okay? Or it kind of can radiate to some other place. The pain could radiate somewhere else, all right? But usually it's associated, there's known association with referred pain, and it gives an indication of kind of what's going on. This is what diagnoses are, right? So we start with these things, understanding the anatomy, talk about where things are. You can start to make diagnoses, or at least like inferences, right? So an inference of, hey, Tommy didn't hurt his appendix if he's got pain on his left upper quadrant, right? Your stomach's not doesn't really feel, don't have a gastric ulcer if you're feeling pain in your right lower quadrant, right? That's kind of the types of things that you can kind of rule out, right? From just understanding those. So this breaks down the regions where things are. Okay. And that then brings us to the last part of the chapter. We talk about regulating the internal environment of the body, right? Keeping the body at a relative constant set point. And we mentioned this last week as well. All right, keeping things consistent. All right, and that is maintaining homeostasis. All right, and your body has a number of these, what we call homeostatic mechanisms to maintain. And last week we mentioned one at one point, which was, what am I doing? 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. What's that? Normal body temperature. Okay? So I'm standing here walking around, moving, talking. What's happening to my body temperature? It increases a little bit. Okay? So it starts to go up. Is that a change from normal? Yes, it's a change. Okay? How does my body recognize that change? Is it important that it recognizes that change? Yes, it is. How do we do it? So we're going to talk about negative feedback in a second. Let's get to the... So how does my body how does this room, we'll talk out away from the human body for a second, how does this room recognize the temperature in here? The thermostat. Okay? Your body has a thermostat as well, right? We have a normal set point, and we can recognize whether or not it goes higher or lower, right? There's something that recognizes the change. That first thing that recognizes the change is a receptor, okay? That's the first part of the homeostatic mechanism, right? It recognizes the change, or what we call a stimulus. The receptor recognizes this stimulus. And the stimulus in terms of body heat is that we have an increase or a decrease, a change from normal. Okay? So the stimulus is increase in body temperature. Receptor recognizes that. Now what? So some cell in my body, organ, whatever, recognizes increase in body temperature.
Sweat.
Okay, so the body's response is going to sweat to bring it down. What tells my body to sweat? Where does this signal go to? From the receptor to where? Right? It goes to the brain, right? Or the nervous system. We collectively call those things what we call the control center. Okay? And what that does, that's the second part, it integrates the information. Right? The signal is sent in, it's interpreted as increase in body temperature. It could be interpreted as decrease in body temperature, and that would be problematic, right? Sometimes you end up with a fever, but you get the chills. Everything's screwed up in there, right? When these systems go off, you end up with some disease state, sickness, pathology that happens. Okay? So the control center interprets the signal from the receptor, what the stimulus is, and then figures out what the appropriate response is going to be. Right? So now it sends a signal to, let's go back to our example. What happens when my body temperature goes up?
Sweat.
You sweat. Where does the sweat come from? Released from glands, right? Those glands or those muscles that respond to the control center are collectively called, generic term, called effectors. Okay? And then that's going to have the response. In our example, we have sweat that happens. And now, start sweating, what is the goal of that response?
To lower the temperature thing.
What's going to happen to my temperature?
Well, you want it to lower after you start sweating.
Right, so we want to, in this case, go down. Most of the responses are going to counteract the original stimulus. The original stimulus was that my body temperature went up. Now I start sweating in order to bring my body temperature back down. Okay? Most of these homeostatic mechanisms go by this, right? This type of mechanism, right? The cycle, whereby the response counteracts the stimulus, and that is called negative feedback. Okay? The response counteracts the stimulus. And that works to keep my body temperature, as an example, close to 98.6. It's going to go up, it's going to go down, but it's going to fluctuate somewhere in there. Right? It's never going to get too high, hopefully. It's never going to get too low, hopefully. Right? And if it does, my body has these mechanisms that can bring it back to normal. Okay? Those are the parts, so 1, 2, and 3 effectors are the parts of each homeostatic mechanism. Each one has a receptor, right, which responds to a stimulus. The control center is either the nervous system or the endocrine system. Those two systems work together to regulate all the other systems. Okay? They then message to effectors either by electrical stimulation through the nervous system or hormones, okay, through the endocrine system. And the effectors, muscles, glands, they now initiate and carry out the appropriate response. Right? Hopefully, you're not starting to shiver when your body temperature goes up. To make your body temperature go up more. Okay? We don't want to mix up those responses. So that's negative feedback. Okay? So receptor detects the change. The change is the stimulus. Okay? Control center interprets that input from the receptor. All right? And initiates the appropriate response. Signals to the effector to carry it out. Hey, sweat glands, get on. Let's go. Hey, muscles, start shivering. We're cold. Okay? All of that goes through the same negative feedback. Here's a diagram from your textbook. Same thing, right? Stimulus, receptor. In this case, they actually include the stimulus as one of the parts. You should, because without the stimulus, the receptor is pointless. All right? Receptor detects the stimulus, control center, and then the effector. And the point of this is to restore homeostasis. Restore body temperature to 98.6. Restore blood pressure back to 120/80. All right, restore heart rate back to 60 beats per minute. Okay? Questions? Good. Okay, so most of these operate by negative feedback. Not all of them. What would happen, right? So negative feedback, the response is opposite or opposes to, counteracts the stimulus. Stimulus is to go up, body temperature goes up. Response is to work to lower body temperature. So negative feedback opposes the stimulus. What does positive feedback do? It enhances the stimulus. So, like I said, most of these operate by negative feedback. There are some that operate by positive feedback. Okay, but in body temperature wise, in our example, what would happen if it had positive feedback? So now it comes back around. Body temperature goes up, recognize it, response would be to make your body temperature go up more, right? Is that coincident with life? That's going to keep going, right? That's not going to work because I'm just going to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And that could lead to lots of problems. That's where sometimes fever works, okay, where you end up with this kind of disruption, okay, or the set point is changed. Maybe my body temperature is usually set at 98.6, but because I have a infection, viral infection, right, now my set point is like 102, right? That happens as well, okay? Temperature regulation is a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, blood sugar, negative feedback. Blood pressure, heart rate, all of those are negative feedback mechanisms. There are a few positive feedback mechanisms, and probably the most well known is what occurs during child labor, right, or giving birth. Okay, positive feedback, all of the things are the same. We still have a stimulus, receptor, control center, response. But the response through the effectors is going to make the stimulus more. Okay? We've all seen the sitcoms, ER, Grey's Anatomy, whatever you want, The Resident, whatever medical show on. They have all had, at some point, a woman who is giving birth, whether it's in a cab or taxi, cop car, whatever, right? We've all seen it. What happens to the contractions during childbirth? They increase. They increase in intensity, and they get closer and closer together, right? That is because of a positive feedback mechanism, okay? The original stimulus, 9.5 months pregnant, the fetus has grown to its capacity, okay? It recognizes that and releases a hormone into the female, through the blood into the female bloodstream. All right. Also, the fetus sits lower and starts to push pressure on the cervix. Okay. That pressure on the cervix is the stimulus that the mother recognizes in the brain control center. Okay. Feels that pressure. That initiates the release of oxytocin, a hormone, right? That causes uterine contractions, right? The uterus contracts, increases the contraction of the uterus, actually causes more pressure to be put on the cervix. More pressure, another stimulus, more oxytocin, which leads to more pressure. See how this goes, right? It's a circular loop. It's like you're caught in a never-ending loop in a computer program. It's just going to keep going. It's going to get more the contractions get more intense, right? More pressure on the cervix, more hormone, and so on. Okay, until they get so close. How does it end? How do these positive feedback mechanisms end? What's the end point of childbirth? Childbirth. It's a defined point, right? At some point, there's not going to be any more pressure on the cervix because the fetus has pushed through the birth canal. Okay? The other examples, breastfeeding and blood clotting, right? Blood clotting, at some point, there's no more blood going through the open wound, right? In breastfeeding, the end point is that the infant isn't nursing anymore. Stops nursing, endpoint. Without a defined endpoint, they continue to go. All right, so it's important to understand there is a defined endpoint. The negative feedback can up and down, right? And here's your breastfeeding baby, right? Stimulus, baby suckles, understands that connection. The receptor understands that stimulus, sends the relay to the control center of the brain, releases hormone, which then leads to what we call milk letdown, production of milk and release of milk from the mammary gland. And the baby feeds and continues until he or she's done. End point. Okay? Now, most of these homeostatic mechanisms, like I said, negative feedback, right? They are dynamic. What does dynamic mean? Are they the same all the time? No, they're not. They're dynamic. They can change, right? They respond. actually respond to changes. Control center is generally the nervous system, right, or the endocrine system, right? And for most of these are going to be most of them are going to be the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Talked about our components, right, and most through negative feedback. If these systems fail or are disrupted, leads to problems. Okay? An example of that, or disease, is what we'll talk about in a minute. We have normal ranges for this. Body temperature, 98.6. We have a normal amount of blood, glucose in our blood, between 80 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. Right? Normal blood pressure, normal heart rate. Okay, normal amount of calcium or oxygen in our blood. Those are set so that our body functions in a normal capacity. And they change, and we respond to those changes. Okay? And if they're disrupted, we can cause problems. Here's an example of a disruption. Diabetes. How many of you have heard of that so far? Right? We all know what Ozempic is and all these other pharmaceutical things that adjust and help regulate blood sugar. Okay? Blood sugar is regulated by two hormones. Anyone know what they are? What's one of them? Insulin. The other is glucagon. And they work opposite to one another. Okay? Diabetes occurs when you can no longer lower your blood sugar because of insulin insufficiency, insulin insensitivity, right? Either one of those two. So diabetes type 1 is childhood onset, okay? And that happens when someone can no longer, doesn't produce enough insulin, all right? What's the normal action of insulin? Does it raise blood sugar or lower it? It lowers it, all right? So I have a nice big breakfast of pancakes and some maple syrup, lots of carbs, okay? Maybe consume that, start to digest it. The glucose is absorbed in my intestines and goes into my bloodstream. What happens to my blood sugar? It goes up, right? More glucose in the blood, it goes up. It goes above 110. Stimulus, yes? Receptors recognize that, send it to my nervous system. Nervous system sends the relay to my pancreas. In response, normal response, I release insulin. Insulin targets all of my cells to move glucose out of the blood and into the cells. So now my glucose in the blood goes down because it's no longer in the bloodstream, it's in cells. Okay? Or it's stored as fat. Make sense? Okay. What happens when I don't have insulin? I'm a diabetic. I can't make it. What happens to blood sugar? Does it go down? No. Not for a very, very long time. Okay? Your blood cell, your cells will move it out, but it's going to take a while because insulin helps that to go quickly. Okay? So my blood sugar stays really high for a really long period of time. Okay? That's not good, can cause headaches, can cause nervous problems, cause seizures, etc. Okay? That is type 1 diabetes. I don't produce insulin. What's type 2 diabetes? Not overproduction, overstimulation. Okay? I have my pancakes again, blood sugar goes high, right? But before insulin can actually bring my blood sugar back down, maybe like an hour later, I have a liter of Mountain Dew. An hour after that, I got a Coke and a Snickers candy bar. What's happening? My body's working to bring it down. I'm having insulin release, but I just keep bringing it back up, right? So as my body's working to bring it down and producing insulin, what's happening to the rest of my cells is that they're becoming blind to the message, right? All insulin's here, it's now insulin insensitivity. Either the cells that insulin targets doesn't have a receptor and they're not going to work anymore, or insulin's here all the time, whatever. Just come in. I don't care, right? Guy knocks on your door all the time, you're not going to answer it anymore. Okay? That's insensitivity. And that can be changed by diet and some other medications as well. All right? But you have medications that can work to do that. Yes?
What would the opposite be then?
So the opposite, great question. So what was the other hormone that does this? We said it's glucagon, right? So the opposite then is blood sugar goes down. That's the stimulus. Okay? Instead of same kind of receptor control loop, control center, pancreas, different cells in the pancreas release glucagon. Glucagon stimulates the liver to move, break down like how the storage form of glucose and puts it in the blood, so it helps maintain it like that. Okay? And what happens if glucagon's not there? You end up with someone who has low blood sugar for a long period of time, be hypoglycemia, and cause lethargy, seizures, etc. Right? Fainting, paleness. Okay? Good question. All right? And another one here is, another example is SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Okay? Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that targets neurons and gives you that good euphoric feeling. Okay? If you don't produce enough of this, you tend to be depressed a lot. Right? So some people who have suffer from depression are doing so because they don't produce enough serotonin. All right? So the way serotonin works is it's released into the synapse, the separation between neurons, and it stays there for a period of time. Binds to its target, and it gives you the good feeling. Okay? If I don't produce enough, a lot of it gets reuptaked into the neuron that releases it. Okay? So this inhibitor allows that serotonin to stay in the synapse longer. I only produce a little bit, but if it stays longer, it will still give me the good feeling, initiate those neurons that make me increase my mood, etc. Okay? So now the homeostatic mechanism is disrupted because of how much we're producing. We are trying to intervene somehow and return that back to normal. And that's really what we come down to with most of our disease states and medications. Our medications are working to return homeostatic mechanisms to normal. Okay? Questions? Yes?
So like for like type 2 diabetes,
Yep.
for example, can it retrain the cells to function at that normal rate, or will it always kind of stay like that?
So it depends how long the type 2 diabetes goes, like how severe it is. There's a point where it's so prolonged that you end up like becoming insulin dependent, and it has to be a different kind of structure or different stimulus in that case. Most or a lot of type 2 diabetics can retrain their cells by removing that high level of blood sugar and kind of like resetting the response system. So the first step in treating a type 2 diabetes is exercise, right, and diet. Got to move around, got to get rid of that, lower that blood sugar, change your diet so it stays pretty low. It stays low, then the insulin response goes away, right? So I take all of that insulin kind of flood away from the cells. They now can be resensitized to it. So yes, it can happen, but if it's so long and then you have to become insulin dependent outside of that. So then the pancreas stops producing it because they're not doing it. All right, other questions? Awesome. So we'll stop.